Good morning and welcome to the full council meeting 10th December 2020. Welcome to the members of the public, council staff and elected members. Deputy Mayor Janet Holbrook, would you kindly do the council blessing?
Ia mātou e whiriwhiri ana, ina take ke mua ia mātou aroaro. E pono ana mātou ka kaha tonu, ki te whakapumahara, kua pai mō na hapuri e mahi ne mātou. Me kaha hoki mātou katoa ki a whaihua. Ki a tōtika ta mātou mahi, a matamaia te tiro whakamua me te hihiri, ka taia te arahi I roto I te kotahitanga me te aroha.
Kia ora. Item number 3, apologies. Any apologies? No. Item number 4, declarations of interest relating to items on the agenda. I have not been notified of any. Public speaking time for items relating to the agenda. The first speaker we have is Salima Padamsi speaking on item 9 on TAKUTAI Kapiti. I understand, Salima, you are the chair of Crew.
That's correct.
You've got 5 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So I'm speaking to Council today in my official capacity as the newly appointed chair of Crew. First, I would like to address the relationship between Crew and KCDC. This has not been a particularly successful one. This fact speaks for itself given the number of court actions Crew has taken over the years. Unfortunately, the Council's response to Crew has been to reject Crew's substantial work and effort to resolve coastal hazard issues for the district. In our 2016 court action, KCDC had ensured the court that the plan changes associated with the coastal hazard provisions in the district plan would require a further 4 years to complete. Yet to date, a plan change is nowhere in sight. This, of course, continues to add to our misgivings and the credibility of KCDC to deliver as promised. Secondly, there is the issue of the revolving door of staff. Over the last 8 years, Crew has dealt with over 5 different senior managers and senior staff on the issue of coastal hazards and the proposed district plan. This churning of staff has been destructive to the Council's institutional knowledge. Your staff don't know what they don't know. Over the last 8 years, Crew, its members, and its experts have contributed countless hours of work in producing a number of reports and recommendations on these issues. And quite frankly, I'm not sure that the relevant staff officers have read them or are familiar with the issues being discussed in these documents and reports. This, of course, continues to add to our misgivings and credibility of KCDC to deliver as promised. Next, I would like to raise the issue of the 24th July 2014 Council Resolution and the Coastal Advisory Panel CAP, which is before you today. The 2014 resolutions, and in the spirit in which they were made, were very clear. At the time, Council endorsed the formulation of the Coastal Advisory Group, CAP. Crew, at the request of KCDC, worked with Stephen McArthur to jointly produce terms of reference for CAG. I am tabling those draft of terms of reference for you today. And I ask that you note that they are dated October 7th, 2014. This is version number 7. 7 versions of the document went back and forth between Council and Crew. And then Stephen McArthur left, and no further progress was made. The membership of CAG was to include, among others, submitters to the PDP and coastal landowners. Also at the request of KCDC, Crew submitted a proposed process or a stepped project plan for resolution of the coastal hazard policy development for the PDP. Note that this document is dated 13th December 2014. Again, no further progress was made, and I'm tabling it again. Hopefully, you will now understand why we took court action, because nothing had been done by KCDC to progress this matter. We had assumed, and incorrectly, I might add, that CAP would build on this earlier work. The terms of the group would be set prior to the formation of the group with a clear terms of reference. Instead, here we have a situation where the cart is before the horse. But what I do know, and what I can say with confidence, is that the 2014 resolution regarding CAG and the 2020 recommendations regarding CAP are 2 different beasts. CAG's focus was on coastal hazard, risk assessment, and district plan rules as required under the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement and the RMA, whereas CAP is developing a coastal adaptation plan, a non-statutory plan. You councillors need to know that the legislative or statutory planning process required to be completed by council and now well overdue is not part of the CAP project. The fact that we have yet another delay to the district plan changes, of course, continues to add to our misgivings and the credibility of KCDC to deliver. So where to from here for Crew and KCDC? As chair of Crew, I would like nothing better than to say to my committee and our members that CAP is a process that we can trust and have confidence in. Unfortunately, at the moment, I cannot make that statement. Council needs to demonstrate that it is working towards a CAP which has a genuine community mandate, as was mandated by the Council on the 24th July 2014 resolution. For Crew, this means that we are a part of CAP. If we are not included within CAP, it will be much more difficult to have confidence that the process is genuinely community-led, is making progress, and is representing the most directly affected members of community. I would like to be very clear that excluding Crew can only increase the chances of challenges and further litigation from deeply affected groups who haven't been involved. All this will do is further stall the progress on the issue, which will lead it to be taken out of council hands. Almost finished. We have been down this road before, as is evidenced by the two documents that I'm tabling before you, and Crew does not want to go down this road. It would be like turning back the clock to 2012, in which council uses ratepayers' money for legal representation against its own ratepayers. But this is council's decision to determine and mitigate the level of risk that you are willing to take. From our perspective, I would appreciate a partnership in which Crew and KCDC can work together to get the best possible outcome on coastal hazards and the PDP that benefit the coastal environment as a whole. This requires commitment, perseverance, and trust, which both parties need to rebuild. An open dialogue, input into the terms of reference that are genuinely regarded as valuable input, as opposed to tokenism, collaboration, and inclusion into the CAP, would be a place to start. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your submission. Questions, Councillor Rendell.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Salima, do you have a memorandum of understanding? Crew? Yes. Do they have one? So, like it is said, like the Mayor often says, he has a partnership with iwi, which is basically a memorandum of understanding. Technically, the council also has a partnership with Crew. Would that be correct? Okay. And would you be happy, or would you suggest that Crew has a person specifically appointed, or amended that a person from Crew be appointed to CAP? Yes. Okay, thank you.
Where do I table these?
Councillor Compton.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a quick question. We've been often told about Crew's mandate, or supposed mandate, to represent the community. In 2019, how many paid-up members did Crew have?
Yeah, so I just took over, let's say, a couple weeks ago. So it's been a bit of a baptism on fire for me in terms of catching up. And we're in the process of reviewing that, but I can assure you that it's a substantial number. But I don't have the exact number. If you want me to give it to you, I don't have it.
$20 joining fee in your membership fee?
Waived it for this year.
So for 2020 you waived it. So 2019 it was still in place? Yeah. So I can tell you then you had 50 paid up members in 2019.
But
and
that doesn't mean that we didn't have members that were continuing.
But your website has stated since 2013 that to be a member of Crew you have to pay a $20 annual membership fee.
I understand, but our AGM vote, and we waived it for this year.
Yeah, well, that's right. This year, I'm just saying.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm catching up.
Hang on a moment. I don't want this to be a debate. You ask a question, you get an answer. You ask a question, you get an answer. Let's not turn it into debate. Just caution.
No, I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah.
Amy.
Where we're at. I don't know myself. I couldn't give you a number if you asked me to.
Thank you. Councillor Pravanov.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor, thank you, Salima, for coming along today. So you said that Crew was not going to be part of the CAP. The CAP has not, the membership of the CAP has not been set up yet. So why do you say that you will not be part of the CAP?
I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that we would like to be a part of it. We would like a seat on the CAP.
So what skills could Crew provide to the CAP?
Besides all the work we've done in the past 8 years and the institutional memory and the coastal hazard background and all the expertise that we hold, well, that would be it.
That's all the questions. Thank you very much for your submission. The next speaker we have is Stephen Bale. Item 9.4 on the beach bylaw. You have 3 minutes.
Good morning. Good morning, Mayor, councillors. My name's Stephen Vale. I'm a ratepayer at Waikanai Beach, and I've asked to speak to the council on the recent bylaw proposal. I was unaware of the review and was asked at a consultation to speak. Thank you. I have read the draft bylaw version 3, 2020-1005 consult, and it reads reasonably sensibly and does not appear controversial. Stick with that and we'll see a good status quo as I understand it. However, the beach bylaw statement of proposal with submissions, links and forms PDF is a different matter. It contains a highly emotive language, broad assumptions and long-drawn conclusions. These are not helpful. Claiming feedback indicates more enforcement by bylaws wanted. A much better option is more education and council presence on the beaches. And that's why bylaws exist, but we need to educate and make people aware. Concerns and frustration about motor vehicles on beaches. These comments about speeding, reckless driving, motorcycles, that's on section 46. Section 48, barrier arms to prevent access and vehicles to beaches. This will not stop a single motorbike. Section 47, motorbikes and motorcycles are the most common vehicle to drive illegally and the greatest source of intimidation, annoyance and nuisance to beach users. However, no facts are presented as to how many. I'm living at the beach and spending 3.5 months every year fishing down there, whitebaiter, retired, got the pleasure of doing that. And so I've seen it, and I actually live by the boat ramp, so I actually understand what's happening at the beach quite regularly. I don't see these problems of motorbikes hooning up and down the roads. I have perhaps in the last year seen 2 or 3 instances. The previous year I saw a few more. So I think the restriction on motor vehicles has made a big impact. But that said, I don't think that it has been a major problem for the beach users of what you call intimidation, annoyance and nuisance to beach users. I think most beach vehicle users have been respectful. I'm trying to stick to my notes, so only got 3 minutes. The Waikanai Estuary Scenic Reserve is a nationally scenic, is a significant reserve, and that's in, I think it's section 78. It's not really.
Mr. Will, it's a scientific reserve. It's different. It's not a scenic reserve.
It said scenic. The Waikanai Estuary Scenic Reserve is what is a nationally significant reserve. That's what it's. Well, anyway, what it is, the scientific reserve. It's not really. It was made up to prevent a bridge connecting Queen's Road to Paraparaumu, and solely for that reason has not been used or claimed as much more than what it's set up for. Talk of endangered banded dotterels, sanctuary is annoying. I've seen them in the snow in the middle of the Southern Alps, so they're far from endangered.
You need to find out.
Speed up?
Yes.
Okay, section 80, councillors, reduced vehicles, section 81, these are the ones that are controversial. Install automatic entry barriers. Anyway, moving on, I'll move on to the good ideas. Section 63, greater freedom of vehicles. I probably don't support that, but I think it's actually a good idea. Restrict the so-called scientific reserve at Waikanai. I think that's important. I think that it's been overused as a battering ram to divide the public. The boat ramp at the end of Totiri Street has bollards put up in the middle of it, so you can't access it. These should be removed for recreational purposes for the community. Driving on the beach should be allowed, provided it doesn't disturb other users, and that's the control and education is the best enforcer. The idea of enforcement and restrictive barriers is one over the top, and it is not for a healthy community. And to round up, the aim, in my opinion, should be to develop a respected Kapiti Beach users etiquette that stands out among councils in New Zealand, using community education and promotion, not divisive tactics like enforcement and physical barriers. And I say good luck to you all, because it's a fairly big job. Thanks very much.
Just hang on there. Any questions? Councillor Randall.
I'd like to address a question through you to Mr. DeHaast. Because
I don't think that's proper. You address a question to the submitter.
Okay. Well, my understanding was that submissions had closed for the beach bylaw.
Yes. And I spoke to Grayson, and I wasn't allowed to speak because I hadn't put a submission in. I wasn't aware that there was a review. Partly that's communication problems from receiving at my end. I don't know why. So I had an opportunity to speak to the council here. Given by Grayson, it was supposed to be 9:10, but it's wound up into the agenda.
Well,
so it's not a submission. It's actually
the matter is in the agenda. So he's speaking to a matter on the agenda. That's what it is. Yes.
Can what the gentleman said, we can take that into consideration when we as councillors consider?
I think we just record what he said. The very fact that it's gone into your head is a different matter. The next speaker, Mr. Knighton from the RSA.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Mea Guru and councillors, thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning. My name is Jeff Knighton, and I represent the members of the Paraparaumu RSA. The local RSA marks 100 years of service to veterans and their families in 2021 and wants to mark this milestone event with a suitable memorial in McLean Park. 100 years ago, the population of Paraparaumu was 339, of which 59 volunteered for service and 14 didn't return. Of those that did return, it was tough. There was no formal support for veterans, one doctor, one district nurse, and no hospital, and certainly no knowledge of how to deal with trauma. So the veterans and families gathered together and effectively created the RSA, and this was formed in 1921. The families gathered and fundraised and found a premises at Paraumu Beach from 1925 to 1972, and then to the Paraparaumu Reserve, and returned back to the beach with Club Vista in 2015. The opportunity to unveil the memorial would be an important part of the activities marking this centenary. The RSA fully understands the need for the memorial to fit in with the goals set out in the McLean Park Reserve Management Plan 2017, and that it should not restrict the views, the ability of people to relax, or inhibit community use of the area. Our centenary goal is to create a discreet and symbolic memorial in the circular walled garden opposite McLean Street on Marine Parade as a focal point. The intention is to inspire remembrance and honour those early veterans and their families, to give the community a chance to recognise through small commemorations the part played by local people in New Zealand's military history, to promote peaceful conflict resolution, to promote a sense of cultural identity, and to be a point of interest for visitors. The specific memorial structure has not been decided, although a number of ideas are being considered. The proposal before you provides an opportunity for the council to make the current walling safer and at the same time create a memorial. It is intended for local students and youth to be asked to submit designs for the memorial centrepiece. Should the proposal be approved, the RSA seeks council assistance to engage with local iwi and the community to successfully complete the project. The RSA is prepared to carry out fundraising to contribute to the cost of the memorial and is willing and able to maintain the memorial into the future. Thank you.
Hang on there, Mr. Knighton, just hang on. Any questions? Councillor Elliott.
Thank you very much for coming to speak to us. You gave some dates in the beginning of your talk. Can you just repeat those? I didn't quite catch the dates.
So 1921 was the establishment of the RSA here in Brown. It was actually a sub-branch of Wellington at that time, then became its own branch later.
Okay, and then you gave another date that it moved to.
Yeah, so 1925, the premises in the beach, and then up to Amohia Street, and that was through to 1972.
Sorry, which street?
Amohia?
Oh, yes, okay. Thank you very much. Look, thanks.
Councillor Holiday, did I see your name come up before?
My name's there.
No, his one came up first. And just listen to the chair.
Okay, I've got the red light, so I'll shoot with my question. Thank you so much. I think this is a wonderful, wonderful idea. Is it proposed that it's a simple memorial, or would you more describe it as a work of art, in which case it would be a work of art in a public place and probably should go to the public art panel?
I think essentially symbolic memorial, so less the work of art, to be honest.
I'm just seeing an artistic opportunity.
What a shame she thought. What a shame she thought.
Okay.
Councillor Holiday.
Thanks for coming in. We've already had a chat. Look, just two questions. First, what is the target date for the celebration?
There's a little bit of debate as to when, but we think it's around October 2021.
As such.
No. And I should point out, major stellar commemorations will still be at the normal arch. This is for small commemorations, of which there are a number now, of course. Okay.
About the time frame if it was on Anzac Day, but October sounds good. If for some reason there are issues with regards to a permanent structure there, would you be open to looking at a temporary structure while things are resolved?
I don't know, I'd have to refer back to my colleagues, but essentially, Martin, I think it is about having something permanent for the future, and part of that was the involvement of the youth, to bring them on board around that, and focus on peace and sacrifice, not glorification of war. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Knighton.
Thank you,
the next speaker we have is Mr. Paul Dunmore, item 9.1, TAKUTAI Kapiti. Mr. Dunmore, welcome.
Thank you, Mayor and councillors. I'm no longer a member of the Committee of Coastal Ratepayers United, and I don't speak for Crew. However, I was the chair until the last AGM, and I think it was Councillor Compton asked about membership, was it? I can confirm that the financial statements, which are public information, show fee revenue, membership revenue of $1,000, which is 50 members. If the council is concerned that that is not enough members, you could run a very effective membership drive by putting back on the limbs the sort of information that was there some years ago. When things are quiet, we don't recruit a lot of new members, but we do retain a lot of expertise. I was a member of the design group until the very end of the process, and that's really why I wanted to say a few words today. The process of working together was slow and laborious, but the final report was a consensus of the members of the group, and I agreed to all of the words in the report. The problem, however, is with the words that are not in the report. There is no meaningful expectation of how the panel should go about its business. Some members of the co-design group are familiar with strategic planning and similar exercises and understand what approaches are efficient and effective and what approaches are likely to fail. I made various attempts to write guidance for the panel to help it do its job effectively. Despite support from some community members, not only Crew representatives, I was unable to make any headway with this. The staff's fairly firm view was that these were matters for the panel to decide for itself and should not be in the terms of reference. The co-design group really never had an opportunity for substantive discussion of these issues. Staff set the agendas for the meetings, and there were always other matters to fill the agenda. I see, therefore, a high risk that the panel will fail to work effectively at a difficult task. If councillors wish the panel to succeed, I think you'll need to pay attention to the choice of chair and to the approach that the panel adopts. I'd be happy to provide councillors with a few examples if you'd wish. There's another matter for your attention, which is the plans that your staff have for protecting council infrastructure. To make it concrete, my house is behind Marine Parade on Paraparam, and once that street can no longer be kept open with the power and the internet that comes along it, then my house will have to be abandoned. It may have to be abandoned earlier, in fact, if you can no longer continue to supply the sewer and water. So how does council propose to defend Marine Parade against sea level rise? Is beach renourishment planned for the first 10 centimetres, say, in the immediate future? And if so, is that in the long-term plan? After that, once beach renourishment no longer works, will a seawall be planned? And will that be effective until, say, 2 metres, after which Marine Parade will have to be abandoned? Or will the road be abandoned after just 50 centimetres of sea level rise? These are essentially engineering questions, and if KCDC can decide this and tell everyone its plans, then property owners like me can take them into account, and planners can write rules that are consistent with them. But if KCDC does not develop such plans or commit to them, then virtually nothing else can be done. The community panel can't deal with these questions. What is needed is the knowledge of engineering and of KCDC's specific infrastructure assets. Without a commitment to such plans, and without a public commitment to such plans, there seems to be nothing useful that the community panel can discuss about adapting to climate change. In that case, I suggest it would be better not to spend the money on it. So thank you for your attention and best wishes for your decision. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
There may be questions. I can, on your first item, in terms of the expertise that you hold, I think it will be valuable. I can assure you of that. Having said that, my question is, where do you think the insurance companies' interest in this area lie?
Insurers insure our properties for 1 year at a time. They have no interest in what's going to happen in 50 years' time. They will adapt their policies as time goes on. I think it is inevitable that what will happen is the same thing has happened with leaky buildings and with Y2K problems before that. 1 year you will open your insurance policy for your home renewal and you'll find they've added another clause that says something like, if your property is below 5 metres above sea level and within 50 metres of the beach, you're no longer covered for inundation and erosion and rising groundwater. And that will be the signal that the insurance companies have basically backed out of this. They cannot cover the effects of sea level rise. It's not their business. They don't take the revenue that will deal with that. Their business is insuring 10,000 houses, and when 2 of them burn down, they take the policy proceeds from the 10,000 houses to make the payouts. They cannot cover risks that affect virtually everybody. That's why war damage isn't covered, for example. It simply isn't insurable. And I think we'll find sea level rise is not insurable either.
Thank you. Councillor Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Paul, thank you, Paul. My question is relating to the, and I raised it before, the a memorandum of understanding that council signed with Crew, right? And they also have, council also has a memorandum of understanding with iwi. But with iwi, they constantly refer to it as a partnership. But for Crew, I never hear the word partnership from council. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah. Salima Padansi has not been in the hot seat very long and hasn't read all of the documents yet, I think. The memorandum of agreement between the council and Crew arose as part of the settlement of the declarations case from a couple of years ago. It's quite limited. Council commits to consult us and, I'm no longer Crew. Council commits to consult Coastal Ratepayers United to keep them well informed, but there's no implication of a co-governance role, and my understanding of the iwi partnership agreement is that it goes well beyond that sort of thing. So there is an agreement, a memorandum of understanding, but its approach and its content is quite different.
Thank you, Bernie. And next, Councillor Coates.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks for coming along. I think you might have just answered this, but in the interest of clarity, I thought I'd ask the question again. Just following on from Councillor Randall's question, and from having heard you a number of times, I know you're an intelligent and well-versed individual. Your understanding of the relationship between councils, not just this council, and iwi, is under the treaty. Could you explain, or are you aware of the difference between council's obligation to its treaty partners as opposed to community groups or members under MOUs?
Quite so. The modern interpretation of the Treaty of Waitangi seems to be that it created a partnership between the tribes and the Crown. This council is part of the government, and so it is bound by the Treaty of Waitangi. I'm a New Zealand citizen. I am not bound by the Treaty of Waitangi. I am bound by the law, and the government, the Parliament and the Council will pass laws which bind me in ways that presumably give effect to the treaty. But I'm not directly bound by the treaty in the way that you are. But you'd obviously need to take that into account, and the controversial one at the moment, of course, is the question of the composition of the advisory panel. And so you have different requirements on you than the community does. The only point I think I would add to that is that the community members are not treaty partners, and so whatever balance there might be between iwi representatives and council representatives, I think the community members stand outside of that.
As a follow-on from that, would you acknowledge that council has a higher responsibility in its obligations to its treaty partners, and for example consent conditions and so forth, than it does for just community?
Absolutely, and that's written into the law in all kinds of places.
Since we are discussing this, and it'll be useful to continue this further, can I ask that if you are aware that the decisions of the panel or the reports of the panel comes to council before, and council being elected representatives, and here we do not have 50% treaty partners in community balance. You would note that here, apart from Councillor Coates, I think there are no elected members as councillors who've got direct EB relationships. Just saying. Councillor Elliott might have, but
is that a question about council over government?
Yeah, are you aware around the council table in terms of the treaty partnership being expressed in 50% partnerships?
That's outside my pay grade. Questions about the electoral law are certainly not something that I have more than a casual knowledge of or interest in, and certainly not something that I was ever concerned with as a chairman of Crew. If you're asking whether your governance arrangements are adequate to give effect to the Treaty of Waitangi, I'm the wrong person to ask.
I withdraw that question from you. Councillor Holbrook.
Yes, I'm just making sure I've interpreted your statements about what you think the panel needs to bring in terms of expertise. So I heard that you think that future-focused strategic planning ability and sound technical knowledge of the issues are important attributes to bring to the community representative part of the panel?
I think they need to be in the panel. That does not mean that everybody needs to be a technical expert, and we agonised quite a bit about the wording of what the attributes of the panel should be. And I think we, in the end, I don't have it in front of me, but I think in the end we said something about the panel as a whole has to have these sorts of knowledge and expertise. I'm more concerned with the process. I'm worried that, for example, Council decided to appoint a technical expert advisory company before it was clear, or it is clear, what information the panel is going to need to deal with its decisions. The focus for an effective process would be, in my view, identifying your objectives, identifying the risks, the threats to those objectives, identifying the sort of responses that you might make to those threats, recognizing that individuals, property owners, as well as the council, make these decisions and have responsibility. And then you can start to say, well, what information would help us choose between these alternatives? I'm concerned that the process which has appointed the consulting firm first may, in the end, not lead to the most effective use of available information. And the information that is needed may not be available, and the decision may be, well, we've got this other information which is not really relevant, but let's take it into account anyway. So a focus on the effective approach to decision making, the stages that you need to go through, I think is not in evidence in the CAP document. That doesn't mean the CAP can't do it effectively, but it's not being specified as part of its requirements. And so this is why I was suggesting that Council needs to pay attention to how the CAP goes about its task. Not you haven't finished when you've approved this document and appointed the CAP.
Councillor Pravanov.
Chair, thank you, Paul, for coming along today. So I pressed my button and you've partially answered my question. So at this point in time, there's no terms of reference for the CAP. From what you're saying, are you saying that a terms of reference should be set up before the panel is actually members are identified, so that the best candidates can be put onto the panel, and from there, and I suppose during that they can actually sort out, or they have an idea about what scope of work needs to be looked at as well?
There is a general scope statement, but there's nothing really more specific than that. So at least you know, if you appoint the CAP, you know what sort of matters they're going to have to address and what you'll get in your final report. What there is not is any guidance to the panel on how they might do that effectively, and there's not really guidance on the specific sort of matters that they, I think, need to take into account to do that. So I think there is less guidance than there ought to be, and that causes several problems. One is there is a risk that they may adopt inefficient approaches, ineffective approaches to answering the questions that they've got. Another is that effort will be wasted, and ratepayers will pay for consulting services that turn out not to be useful. And the final one is that it will delay the panel. In the co-design group, I had rather naively assumed that Council had given specific instructions to the co-design group on what we were supposed to do. It turned out that you had not. There was only a very vague statement about what the group was supposed to do. So we had to stop, and it really took us about a month or more to discuss the terms of reference that we as a co-design group were going to need to follow. And so if you don't go in, if the panel doesn't start already with the clear marching instructions, they're going to have to stop and work those out for themselves. They may get it wrong, but also it's wasting time, and you don't have the assurance that I think you ought to ask for about what the panel is going to do and how it's going to do it. So.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Dunmore. The next speaker is Andy Mcintyre on the same item.
Good morning, Your Worship, councillors, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. I think I'll be saying things much along the same lines as the previous speaker, but perhaps with my own twist on it. I am an affected ratepayer. I have lived in my present home for 25 years at Raumati Beach, and I'm speaking about the convening of the Coastal Advisory Panel. I fear that the panel may be convened with perhaps less representation on the part of those who are most directly affected by its decisions and its recommendations, that it may be convened with people who perhaps lack the relevant expertise, and possibly convened without an adequate terms of reference. that if there is limited representation of the people most affected by the panel's deliberations, it may be construed that it is not truly a community-led process. That if the panel lacks the resources or the expertise, that its decisions and recommendations may be seen as less robust than would truly be desirable, and that would open us to yet another round of time-consuming and expensive litigation. And furthermore, finally, that to convene the panel without a clear terms of reference could possibly be seen as demonstrating a lack of governance on the part of council. And I feel that as ratepayers, we can expect, or should be able to expect, good governance from our elected members. Thank you.
Thank you. We got a question from Councillor McCann.
Kia ora, and thank you very much for coming today. I just want to ask you a question about one of your statements there, and I just got it down. Do you not think that actually all the ratepayers are affected by those deliberations, not just homeowners who are in the line of fire of climate change, should we say?
To a great degree, yes. However, the restrictions that were placed upon coastal ratepayers under the proposed district plan, which precluded us from improving or extending our properties, led to quite some uproar amongst those ratepayers. And I think it would be unfortunate to upset them again. And it's been quite interesting. I've had a lifelong association with the coast, and it's been quite exciting to see this area develop and grow. And that by and large, the development along the coast has been ratepayers spending their own money to enhance their properties. And really, as property owners, they, I think, would appreciate the opportunity to have the choice as to whether to spend their money on their homes or not, and not to have that choice taken away from them. In that sense, they are rather more affected than other ratepayers.
So to clarify, you are suggesting that homeowners who may be affected by climate change should have more say or representation on the committee. Is that what your position is?
I don't know about more say, but I think they would like to feel that they have been adequately represented so that they can have to not find themselves blindsided by what comes from the panel's deliberations.
Councillor Hanford.
Kia ora, and thank you again for coming in to speak. And following on from the question that Councillor McCann had around those who will be most impacted, what role do you see for young people in rangatahi, considering that for us the decisions and recommendations brought to us by the CAP will then determine what kind of future and coastline we end up inheriting? So what kind of, I'm interested around, you're talking about those who will be most impacted, how do you see young people fitting into that equation?
Really, it's a while since I was a young person, but to me all that mattered was that there was sand and there was waves, and I so much enjoyed coming to Peka Peka. It was a very different business to the beaches around Wellington Harbour, and that the coast will still be there, the beach will still be there, maybe the homes will be there, maybe they won't. I'm quite a fan of architecture and find it very exciting seeing the changes in style and the nature of the buildings on the coast, but other people have other interests. But I feel certainly parts of the coast are accreting, and there's amazing sand dune formations further up the coast. New Zealand is a very diverse and dynamic place with a very large coastline. And I think some young people may aspire to owning a lovely beachfront home, and others might aspire to enjoying the nothingness. And I think there is enough coastline for both those pleasures to be pursued. Would that be a Does that answer your question? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McIntyre. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Worship.
That brings us an end to item 5, public speaking time for items relating to the agenda. I'll go to item number 6, members' business. A public speaking time responses that will be responded during the items as they come up.
Darren can respond to the RSA if you wish.
The Chief Executive said, Darren, you got a response on the...
Yes, through you, Mr. Mayor. So in terms of the RSA discussion about the memorial, I can confirm Parks has been working with the RSA about options, and there have been some suggestions about the appropriate places for that. The team remain committed to work with the RSA and making sure that there's a proper process to go through, considering how it fits with the management plan, but also consultation with iwi and other partners and stakeholders as well.
Thank you. Mr. Chief Executive.
I'd just like to add a couple of comments, though. There is a conflict in terms of the use of that suggested space, because that's for the Saturday market overflow that is intended to be used during summer, so it isn't quite as straightforward as just opting to use that space. And the other concern that I have is that only about 5 years ago, at the behest of the RSA, we spent a lot of money in Amoia Street on the memorial. They then moved. Now they'd like us to have some sort of recognition where they currently reside. I think I have to look ahead and go, what happens if in 5 years they move again? Are we then going to be asked to do yet another memorial in another space at council cost? So we really do need to work through these considerations. There was a real undertaking given by the then president of the RSA that once the memorial was upgraded, there wouldn't be another request of us. And as time goes by and other circumstances change, we now see another request. And I do think we have to bear that in mind. We've put a lot of money and effort into that memorial arch.
So what the Chief Executive is saying is conversation is continuing. Thank you. Leave of absence. No? You on Christmas off. And the Grinch said? You didn't want a response to that? Matters of an urgent nature? No, I have not been advised of any. Mayor's report, you've got a copy of that. Will somebody kindly move to...
So moved.
So moved. Seconded. General Holbrook. All those in favour say aye to accept it. Aye. Carried. We are now on item number 8. Updates. The first one is the representation review preparation. I think we've got Janice and Mr. Dale of Sofsky. Have I got the name right? Cool. You must be an Indian like me. Welcome. To let you know that this report will be at a very high level, and also, can you reserve your questions till after the presentation?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you, Morena koutou. You have met Dale Ofsosky before. Dale is the Director of Election Services and is working with us to provide support on the technical requirements around carrying out the representation review. Today, Dale will be giving you a brief update on the key considerations that will come before you early in the new year as we kick off, I guess, the hard work that comes with this process. This update today foreshadows the more detailed conversations that Dale will be leading you through, starting in February, prior to community engagement that will explore and help refine options for your consideration for inclusion in the draft proposal around our representation review that would need to go out to public consultation. So with that, I'm happy to hand over to Dale. Dale, thank you for being here today.
Kia ora tātou. Good to see everyone again this morning. And it's really just to keep this issue to elected members, to the fore of elected members' thinking, really. Time soon slips away, and then we're into Christmas, and then, of course, we're into the representation review. So what I'll cover off this morning quite briefly is a summary of our briefing that we first had in the 4th of August, and then an overview of today's update, a recap of earlier decisions, current arrangements briefly, what the 3 legislative requirements we have to look at, and that is communities of interest, effective representation and fair representation. What we're going to potentially look at around engagement and communications at a high level, process and timetable, and a summary. So what did we discuss back on the 4th of August? We covered the electoral system, Māori wards, what is and why are we required to do a representation review, what our current arrangements were, and an introduction on what needs to be considered in a review. That's your 3 legislative requirements. The requirement or the need, in my view, for preliminary consultation, and then a tentative timetable. So today, it's just really a high-level overview. It's to get our thinking processes going around what are our communities of interest, how best are these represented, consideration of that rule, the plus or minus 10% rule, preliminary community engagement, and workshops or briefings that are going to follow in 2021. Just to point out that it works better, a representation review works better if we have a collaborative approach with council and its community boards and its communities. We're all working together for the best outcome for the district. And it's important that we bring our communities with us to understand, for our communities to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, and to seek their participation and their contributions. So early decisions were where we made the decision to retain STV back in August, and public notice was made, and for regards to Māori wards, resolved not to establish Māori wards, but no public notice was required for 2022. I won't go through the current arrangements. We're all familiar with those. 10 councillors plus the mayor, 5 elected at large, and 5 elected from 4 wards, and 16 community board members from 4 community boards. That's just a map there. We do have the latest population figures that we must use for next year, and for those councillors elected from wards, you can see that there are 2 wards, which is no surprise, that fall outside of the plus or minus 10%, and that's minus 13.53 for Otaki and 26.6% for Waikanae. Noting, of course, that these 2 wards veered outside the plus or minus 10% at the last review anyway, and was in fact supported by the Local Government Commission back at that point. So current factors. Do current arrangements reflect our community's needs and expectations? What about our growing population? What about our changing communities? What about our roading infrastructure and the impact that has? Just mentioned that we have 2 wards currently non-compliant. What about the right number of councillors? Is it about right that we have 10? What about the workload of those councillors? Should it be 8 or should it be 12? These are the questions that we have to consider and work through. What about community boards and the role of community boards? They're the local grassroots governance, so we need to look into that. And just what I said earlier, just reiterate what I said earlier, we need to bring our communities with this process and with councils. So our 3 legal challenges or legal requirements, if you like, that we must consider when undertaking a review is our communities of interest. What are our communities of interest? We need to identify them. They may be current or they may have changed, and we need to really start with a blank canvas and say, what are our communities of interest now? A community of interest is not defined anywhere, but generally it's an area where one feels a sense of community and belonging. It's access to daily goods and services. So where do people shop? Where do people go to school? Where do they play sport? That sort of thing. Physical and topographical features also come into play. So if you've got major rivers or mountains or that sort of thing, or expressways, they actually come into play as well. And once you've identified your communities of interest, and this is a process that we'll be going through next year, early next year, is once you've identified your communities of interest, these can be grouped together if they're similar. If they're not similar, they can't be, but if they're similar, they can be. So we need to consider and workshop later next year or early next year once the results of our community consultation is known. The second area that we have to consider is effective representation. That is, what is the best number of councillors and how should they be elected? As I said earlier, is 10 about the right number? Should we go to 8 or 12 or whatever? And we need to reflect the workload. What is the best way to represent the communities by elected members? Is it by wards, by at large and totally at large, or a mixture as we have now? And if we do retain wards or have full wards, rather, then we need to consider the number and the names and the boundaries and the number elected, etc. And again, this is for consideration once we have the feedback from our community consultation next year, early next year, and that'll feed into this process. And the third one on effective representation is what's the best number of communities and community board members and how should they be elected? So part of the process is we have to consider communities and community boards. It's a legal requirement. So what is the best way to represent local communities? Do we retain or alter community boards? Do we, if we have community boards, what's the number, the names, the boundaries, the number of those that are elected and appointed? Do we subdivide them? So these are questions that we will be working through and again consider and workshop at a later briefing once we have that community consultation known. The last legal requirement that we are required to follow is how do we ensure each councillor represents about the same number of people? That's the population equity equation that we have to follow within plus or minus 10%. It only applies to wards and community boards where those community boards are subdivided. So it's immaterial if, for example, you go at large, or it's immaterial if you have community boards that aren't subdivided. But you have to take that into consideration if you do have wards. Now, there was some changes in 2013 to legislation that allowed some tolerance of that plus or minus 10%, and you can see that in the 2016 determination by the Commission, where that was tolerated because by adhering to that, you actually split a community. So the Local Government Commission do not support splitting communities. So once again, we need to take on board the community consultation around this and feed it into our considerations next year.
I can speak briefly to our engagement and communications. The team is working up a plan for that at the moment, and this is something that we will cover in more detail with you in February when we come back and brief you again. The plan really focuses on three, key components, or key three phases. The first being awareness raising and research, and we have started that lightly this side of Christmas by leveraging off the long-term plan engagement that has been happening, including material about the representation review where we can, and having a placeholder for this as part of that process. There will then, and that will continue in the new year. There will then be engagement on some of the options as we start to develop them over the course of the first half of next year, before then leading into formal consultation on the initial proposal once you have adopted it. So I want to flag with you a couple of the things that we are considering. One being that we are currently exploring the idea of engaging a focus group to travel with us and to travel with you throughout the key stages of the project into next year, so that we have some consistent voice and a consistent customer and community voice represented throughout all stages of the process. We're also looking at some more interactive workshop style tactics than perhaps what we have used in other areas, to see whether we can really engage sectors of the community that we don't hear from on this issue, and also get to a deeper level of conversation than what some of our higher level engagement activities might otherwise generate. Back to you.
Thanks, Janice. So just on process and timetable, so there's really various phases that we do when we undertake a review. Probably the first phase is what Janice has just talked about, and that's about community consultation and engagement, and that's due by the end of February. So what is our community saying to us? What's their view, so that we can feed that back into the thinking process? And then the second phase is once we've got that information, we report that back to council. What are our various options that we can develop around the feedback that we've had, plus the feedback from councillors? And then that develops into, so we might have 3 or 4 options, and then we streamline that down to one initial proposal, and that kickstarts your formal process. So that really is your next phase. You do one initial proposal, you put a public notice out, and it kickstarts the formal process of once ahead of a submission period, which is a minimum of 1 month, and then we close submissions. We hear the submissions, we consider those, and then we either adopt the initial proposal as the final proposal, or we modify that in light of the submissions that we've received and make a final proposal. That is next part of the formal process. That gets publicly notified, and then we're into another 1 month of formal objection period. So there's 2 parts of the formal process where the public can have the right to have their views known. And then we'd be looking at making public notice of a final proposal, and if we are to receive just one, unfortunately it's just one objection or appeal, the whole matter is taken out of council's hands and over to the Local Government Commission for them to review. I should say also that if in our decision we decide to vary outside the plus or minus 10%, that's treated as an objection and goes off to the Commission as well. So if we do land on something that falls outside that criteria, it automatically goes off to the Commission. But I think as long as we've got good rationale or good reasoning, and that everything is thought through, we've researched things and we've consulted widely with the public, the Commission is fairly sympathetic to what the Council will decide. And then we have the, if there's no objections or appeals, then that becomes the basis of election, and we proceed. But as I said, if we just get one, it's off to the Commission, and they have till the 10th of April 2022 to make their determination. So very, very briefly in summary, we need to be thinking about what are our communities of interest. What is the best number of councillors, and how should they be elected? What is the best number of communities and community board members, and how should they be elected? So these are all thoughts that we can have over Christmas. And there will be an update on the community consultation and engagement approach at the end of February, so that we can start that process of community engagement, and then once that leads into the formal process. Kia ora.
Right. So don't forget that this is a pretty high level, so you've got questions on that level. I will leave it to Janice and Dale to respond to the questions. If it is too detailed, I expect you to say that to move this along. So having said that, Janet Holbrook.
Kia ora, thank you for that. There was a lot of mention of community consultation in there, and that's great, but we've heard from our iwi that they need their own consultation, that they're not part of the community, group. So, it should be mentioned separately. So I'm just concerned that in this presentation that wasn't identified separately. So is that going to be, how's that going to be addressed?
So we have a member of the iwi Partnerships team on the project team, and they are currently working up, being able to approach iwi to find out how iwi wants to participate in this piece of work. That is something that we expect to bring back to you in February when we brief you. From a staff perspective, we are open to iwi participating in whatever way they would like to in this process, and see opportunities at all levels of the process for them to do that.
Thank you for that. It sounds like it's well in hand. It just wasn't included in this presentation.
That was an oversight. Thank you for bringing that up.
Another couple of questions through you, Mr. Chair. So the plus or minus 10% and that going to the Commission, does that include retaining the status quo?
Probably status quo will be one of the options that we will investigate because it's there and it does not comply with the plus or minus 10%, but the Commission did approve that at the last round. So depending on the discussions around this table later on this year, we will submit a number of options. That may well be one of them, the status quo, acknowledging that it's outside the plus or minus 10%.
Great. Just one more question, if I might. So the consultation and the research phase, will that include an opportunity for current and potentially past elected members as well to contribute to that? I'm thinking in terms of workload, you know, having been a ward councillor in the past, you know, it would be good to have an opportunity to comment particularly on the workload in those particular kind of areas of representation.
Yes.
Okay, great. So that concludes my questions. Thank you very much for the presentation.
Councillor McCann.
Thank you. It's an interesting question you raised as to what's the right number of councillors, ranging from 0 from some members of our community right through to too many. My question is actually something I don't quite understand is, does having community boards affect the plus or minus 10%? Is that something that is weighed up?
It only comes into play if you subdivide a community board. So what I mean by that is you could have a community board that's that big that elects 6 at large from within that community, and that's the plus or minus 10%. It does not impact on that. However, if the council decides to subdivide that community board, and there might be 3 distinct communities within that community board area, and you might say this community will elect 2, this community will elect 2, and this community will elect 2, which makes up the 6 from that total community board. Then the plus or minus 10% rule comes in. So you've got to have about the same number of people representing each member of that subdivided community board. Does that help?
Thank you.
Councillor Elliott.
Thank you very much. Excellent report, and yes, I probably won't be thinking about this over Christmas, to tell you the truth, but I definitely will be coming back to work in Feb. So I just have a question. Given social media gives a platform for a multitude of strong opinions on the value of governance groups, and the proposed engagement would probably definitely open up a window for that conversation. Is the management of this conversation and how to enable everyone to have a view going to be part of your consideration in designing your engagement?
Yes, and so yes is the short answer. I guess the other point that I'd like to acknowledge there is that it is important that we design a communications and engagement approach that allows for a range of voices to be heard. That is important, but it is also important that we design the process so that a range of voices can be heard and not drowned out by voices that maybe are stronger than others. So through tactics like a focus group and some of our other workshop, ideas that we're working through, our intention would be to strip out some of the noise that often is attached to governance-related matters and take more of a human or user-centred design approach to working through some of these options.
Councillor Coates.
Thanks very much for the presentation, and I appreciate that this is just a presentation within this meeting. It's not the actual document that's going out there. Yeah. But on page 9 in the slide there around the summary, and I've come from a community board background, so this is not a sort of a predetermined view that I have, but the statement in there around what is the best number of communities and community board members, can tend to be leading. It's making a statement that there is community boards, and I know that part, having gone through the Super City discussion, if we're trying to look at a clean slate and look at what does good look like, then that could be without community boards and more councillors with more support. I'm not saying it should be, but to enable that discussion, we need to be careful in our language that it doesn't lead people to think a certain way, and that statement for me could do that if that appeared out there. So again, it's not a position that I have, it's just if we're going to do the process, we need to make sure that it allows for all views to be heard and considered.
Absolutely, and we start with a clean slate, basically. These are the external boundaries, and this is the process that we'll follow. So what are our communities of interest? And then how are they represented? And those communities of interest could be represented by wards at large, by community boards, subdivided, all those sorts of... It's all up for grabs, if you like, all up to investigate. So we're not taking anything for granted that just because you have community boards, they're going to be retained. They may not be.
I'm hearing that. The statement just doesn't say that.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Councillor Compton.
Through the Mayor, this presentation was really good, and it's got lots of, I guess, those sort of critical dates in terms of what we have to hit. Is this going to be made available as on the website and on LG Hub and whatnot?
The presentation can be popped into LG Hub for you all to refer back to. We are developing a web page around the representation review that will include a series of dates as well.
Excellent, thank you.
Councillor Pravanov.
Thank you, Dale, for coming along. Very interesting presentation. So I just looking at the table, I'm a Waikanae Ward Councillor, so obviously I can see that the plus or minus is there. So just this general question. So you've got the dates here, population estimates for June 2020. Is it appropriate to include any growth predictions?
The figures that I've got there are the latest figures that are based on the 2018 census updated by Department of Stats to June 2020 and are the figures to use. Okay, so we've got no more newer figures to come through. These are the figures. What you can do is look at your plus or minus 10% if you're wanting to have a bit of growth potential in an area. For example, you could look at going closer to that plus or minus 10% rather than right on 0 or 1%. To reflect any potential growth. But the rationale why a council is required to undertake a rep review every 6 years is to reflect growth. Now, having said that, the law also requires permits a council to undertake a review in 3 years if it so wishes. So that can also reflect if there's significant growth. That can also the job can be undertaken again in 3 years if so desired.
And just to clarify too, so what you're saying is that there's no legal obligation to keep to that plus or minus 10%?
There is a legal obligation to comply with that plus or minus 10%. However, there is some tolerance via the local government commission if the council can demonstrate, excuse me, that by veering outside the plus or minus 10% is splitting a community of interest.
Okay. So one thing that's not mentioned in this paper is payment, and I can't remember whether KCD's provided a lump sum for paying elected members, and then it's decided within KCDC staff, so whatever decisions are made down the line will actually affect potentially how that bulk funding will be subdivided.
Remuneration is outside of this process, completely outside. Having said that, we have this question asked by a lot of councillors. I mean, currently it's, there's a pool of money, and if you've got 8 councillors, then it's split 8 ways. If you've got 10, it's 10 ways. But it really is outside of this process. It may be in back of people's minds, but it's not a requirement.
Chief Executive.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just through you, I just want to correct a statement. Staff don't decide the allocation of the pool. You do,
Okay,
and a recommendation goes
it's-
to the Remuneration Authority
Yeah.
about how to divide, and
Okay.
they accept it or not.
Yeah, so council recommend to
So they set the pool,
Yeah.
they set the mayor's salary separately, and then out of the pool,
Yeah, okay.
we bring a paper to you,
Yeah.
as we did this
Yeah,
time,
yeah.
and you get to agree or finally resolve on a preferred approach, which goes to them for approval.
Thank you.
And don't forget the oblique reference by Dale that this issue may be in the back of your minds.
Yes, thank you.
Councillor McCann.
Just following up on what the CE has said, it becomes one of those things that while it's not the purview of the review, clearly there are implications that if you split it 20 ways, then only those people who have significant income can participate as councillors or are retired. So while you probably don't have any ability to take that into consideration, which is my assumption, obviously there is a rationale there somewhere along the line that councillors want to be representative of the community and have the ability to undertake the work. So in some ways it is within the remit, but it isn't explicit. Would I be right in saying that?
Yes, you are right. It's not part of the formal process that we have to follow under the legislation, but as I said, it is in people's minds, and it is a factor that councillors will likely consider.
Looks like run out of questions. Dale and Janice, thank you very much.
Kia ora.
Thank you.
Five-minute break.
You're tough.
Yeah, I mean, we got stuff to do.